In today's episode, we are tackling Lady Jane Grey, famously known as the unlikely Tudor heir who never wanted to be queen, but in the end died for it. Her reign lasted only 9 days, but if we want to be super technical, her reign began on July 6, 1553, the same day as Edward VI's death, making her the 14-day queen. Though Jane was never officially crowned queen, meaning she never had an official coronation. This is possibly why she is still known as Lady Jane Grey and not Queen Jane. I also wanted to quickly clear up something that I kept coming across while researching this episode. Jane Grey is not the shortest reigning monarch in history. A 2-second Google search will easily debunk this. She is, however, the shortest reigning monarch in England's history, so maybe this is where the mix-up occurred. The shortest reigning monarch in history is actually Louis XIX, King of France, who ruled for only 20 minutes before he was forced to abdicate by his father. Like him, Jane Grey was forced to do something against her will. Whereas most people might rejoice in being handed the crown of England, Jane reportedly fell to her knees in tears. You'd think a 17-year-old girl who ruled for just over a week would be rather inconsequential, or mostly forgotten in history, but Jane's short life has been memorialized. She is remembered as the Protestant queen who was executed by the evil Catholic queen, Mary Tudor. Because of this, she is painted as the ultimate victim, the epitome of innocence and naivete, who was manipulated and used as a social and political prop by the power-hungry men around her. But like most things in history, I would take this with a grain of salt. There is no doubt that Jane was used for her birthright and royal blood. During the reign of her first cousin, Edward VI, Jane was the fourth in line to the throne, with Mary being second and Elizabeth third. Jane was a powerful piece to secure. But how did Jane become queen? Mary and Elizabeth were alive and still young, and though deemed illegitimate, they were the daughters of King Henry. Why were they both set aside for the 16-year-old Jane, only for Jane to be deposed 14 days later? What circumstances led to Jane's ascension, and where did it all go wrong? Jane's exact birth date is unknown. Her original birth date was thought to be in October of 1537, but more recent findings suggest that she was born earlier, either in late 1536 or in spring of 1537. She was the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, 1st Duke of Suffolk, and Lady Frances Brandon, daughter of Mary Tudor, King Henry VIII's youngest sister. Jane had 2 younger sisters, Mary and Catherine Grey. She had no living brothers. Jane stood out amongst her family. While her parents and siblings enjoyed hunting and riding, Jane preferred to stay indoors and found comfort in her books. She was dedicated to her studies of the Reformed faith, Protestantism. She excelled in history and languages, learning Greek, Latin, and some Italian, and even Hebrew. This was so she could read the Old Testament in its original state, without the need of a translation. Jane learned and memorized the Lord's Prayer in English. This was entirely new and distinctly Protestant, and only became the norm under Edward VI's reign. It was important for Henry Grey to have his daughters well educated and prepared for their life at court and subsequent marriages. Jane and her sisters learned general etiquette, how to sew and embroider, how to dance, sing, and play instruments. Jane was considered to be one of the most learned young women of her day. There is evidence to suggest that Henry and Frances Grey were strict and possibly abusive towards their eldest daughter. Depictions of Henry and Frances Grey in fiction and even biographies are, in my opinion, out of control. They are both painted as insatiably ambitious and over-the-top cruel towards their daughters, but Frances Grey in particular has probably suffered the most damage to her character because of this. Hester Chapman, a known author and a specialist on the Tudors and Stuarts, wrote in his novel entitled Lady Jane Grey that Frances Grey, quote, could never forgive her daughters for their sex. Mary Lovell, an acclaimed author known for her biographical works, wrote in her novel Bess of Hardwicke that upon the birth of Jane and her sisters, quote, their parents made it abundantly clear that they were a major disappointment. And finally, Alison Weir, a hugely popular author known for her historical fiction, writes that Henry Grey, quote, regarded Jane as a poor substitute for the son who died young before her birth. There is literally no source these authors can cite to back up these claims, except one relatively damning quote from Jane herself. In August of 1550, Henry and Frances Grey went hunting, leaving Jane at home to her studies and books. While they were away, Roger Ascham, tutor of Elizabeth I, arrived and was surprised to find Jane alone and not hunting with her family. It was then that Jane opened up to Roger about her relationship with her parents. Quote, for when I am in the presence either of father or mother, whether I speak, keep silent, sit, stand, or go, eat, drink, be merry, or sad, be sewing, playing, dancing, or doing anything else, I must do it as it were in such weight, measure, and number, even so perfectly as God made the world, or else I am so sharply taunted, so cruelly threatened, yet presently sometimes with pinches, nips, and bobs, and other ways which I will not name for the honor I bear them, so without measure I misordered that I think myself in hell. From this it seems that Henry and Frances had extremely high expectations of Jane, and when she did not perform as expected or obey their demands, she was strictly reprimanded and possibly even physically abused. This is interesting because you rarely hear of such personal accounts. This kind of family turmoil would have been kept very hush-hush at the time, and it would have been a suffer in silence kind of situation. There's only two reasons I can think of why Jane decided to tell Roger this. Either it was all true and the mental and physical abuse was too much for the young Jane to bear, or like a lot of young girls, she wanted to rebel against her strict upbringing. So in an act of defiance, she over-exaggerated the severity of her circumstances. Keep in mind, she was only 13 at the time. I believe Henry and Frances were overly strict, but I don't think they were ever physically abusive to any of their daughters. I think they were very ambitious and didn't really care about Jane's personal feelings, but the personal feelings of a woman were rarely taken into account. When Jane was only 9 years old, she was sent to live at the court of her ailing uncle, King Henry VIII. There she joined the household of Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry. Jane's education continued under the tutelage of the Protestant Queen Catherine. Henry's final will fully entrusted the English throne and succession on his 3 children and their male descendants. But he added a backup plan. Should they die without producing an heir, the throne would pass to the heirs of his youngest sister, Mary Queen Consort of France, and her husband, Charles Brandon. But for unknown reasons, the crown would also skip the daughters of Mary and Charles, Frances and Eleanor Brandon, and instead be passed to the male heirs of Frances and her husband, Henry Grey. Sadly, the pair never had a living son. This put their eldest daughter, Jane, as fourth in line to the throne. By choosing Mary's heirs, Henry completely bypassed his older sister Margaret, Queen Consort of Scotland, and her heirs, including Mary Queen of Scots. In January of 1547, King Henry died, leaving the crown to his only son, Edward VI, and upon the coronation of her stepson, Catherine Parr retired from court to her estate at Old Manor in Chelsea, taking Jane with her. Because of Edward's age, a council was appointed by Henry to oversee Edward until his 18th birthday. Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, brother of Queen Jane Seymour and uncle of Edward VI, was appointed as Lord Protector of the realm and governor of the king's person. This gave him almost complete power over the Privy Council. With his new position, he gave himself the title of the Duke of Somerset. In order to stop any confusion between Edward VI, I'll be referring to Edward Seymour as Somerset for the rest of this episode. Jane remained at Old Manor with Catherine Parr and her new husband, Thomas Seymour, younger brother of the Duke of Somerset and uncle of Edward VI. This marriage took place only 4 months after Henry's death, which damaged Catherine's spotless reputation. But at the time of Henry's proposal, Catherine and Thomas were sweethearts and planned on marrying after the death of her second husband, John Neville. but she couldn't turn down a proposal from the king. With Henry's passing, Catherine and Thomas could now resume their relationship, and Thomas quickly realized that having Jane in his household had certain advantages. He offered her parents money for her wardship, but they were unswayed by his proposition. Thomas then promised to arrange a marriage between Jane and his nephew, King Edward VI. Jane's parents jumped at the opportunity. Due to Thomas's family ties, they believed he could marry their daughter to the king. With this prospect, they willingly gifted Jane's wardship to Thomas. If you're confused about what exactly a wardship is, it's pretty much the same as having custody of a child. To have wardship means you are the primary guardian of a minor, and in this case, it means Thomas had the final say in who Jane married. Having the power to choose who an heir to the throne can marry is a pretty big deal. For Henry and Francis to give up the wardship of Jane is deft in my opinion, but also the Greys found benefit in Jane being in the presence of the Dowager Queen, who was also known for the good education and immense care she gave to her stepdaughter Elizabeth I, who lived with Catherine and Thomas at the time. Shortly after Jane's arrival in Chelsea, Catherine had Elizabeth sent away because of the concerning relationship between the 14-year-old princess and her husband, Thomas. The nature of this relationship is very disturbing. They are still hundreds of years away from understanding words like groomer and predator. It was a different time, but it doesn't make it any less revolting. There is no evidence that Thomas and Jane had a similar relationship. It seems as though his behavior was reserved for Elizabeth alone. Thankfully, Catherine removed Elizabeth from her household and sent her to live with her friend and governess, Cat Ashley. Even though Thomas was literal scum, it seems that Jane thrived under the care and tutelage of Catherine, possibly because she now had the freedom she was never given as a child in her parents' household. Jane admired and respected Catherine. They both shared a love of intellectual pursuits and found joy in each other's company. Under Catherine's encouragement, Jane blossomed. Jane's wardship with the Seymours ended when Catherine Parr died in September 5th of 1548 of childbed fever after delivering her first and only child, Mary. It is assumed that Mary died at the age of 2 because all record of her ends in 1550. Catherine was 36 at the time of her death. She was buried in St. Mary's Chapel on the grounds of Sudley Castle in Gloucestershire. Her funeral was the first Protestant funeral held in English. Lady Jane was the chief mourner. After Catherine's death, Thomas disbanded his household, and Jane was sent back to live with her parents. It was at this time, while Jane was at home, that she met Roger Ascham and told him about the abuse she was living through. Thomas Seymour was dealing with a different kind of struggle, but his was self-induced. His brother, the Duke of Somerset, had reached the end of his rope with Thomas. This tension had been building since before Thomas's marriage to Catherine. Somerset had monarchical power and faced almost no opposition, except Thomas. Thomas wanted a greater share of power. They were both uncles of the king, and therefore Thomas felt entitled to the benefits of such a position. Somerset conceded and offered Thomas a barony, an appointment to the Lord Admiralship, the title that was taken from John Dudley, more on that later, and a seat on the Privy Council. Thomas accepted, but his greed and belligerent ambition was not satisfied. In what I can only describe as a petty tantrum, he attempted to turn Edward VI against Somerset by smuggling pocket money to the king and telling him Somerset held the purse strings too tight and was making him a beggarly king. But Edward was not swayed. In April of 1547, Thomas married Catherine Parr, whose household included 11-year-old Jane and 13-year-old Elizabeth, without the permission of Somerset, which angered him further. Somerset left England to invade Scotland in the summer of 1547, and during his absence, Thomas attempted to form a rebellion against his brother, using his position as the Lord High Admiral, which gave him control over the English Navy. Even after all this, Somerset tried to give his brother a chance to explain himself by calling a council meeting. But Thomas just didn't show up. Shortly after Catherine's death, giving birth to his child, he resumed his disturbing attention on Elizabeth and planned on marrying her. This was also not permitted by Somerset and the council. On the night of January 16, 1549, for reasons completely unclear and truly baffling, Thomas broke into the king's apartments at Hampton Court. He entered through the privy garden and apparently woke one of the king's spaniels. In order to stop the dog from barking, he shot and killed it. You know, in case you needed more reason to hate this guy. Thomas had definitely overstepped, and Somerset was finally finished with his scheming brother. He was arrested the next day. He was accused of 33 charges of treason and condemned to death. Thomas Seymour was executed on March 20th, 1549. Though he had rid himself of one adversary, Somerset would gain many more. 4 months after the execution of Thomas, a rebellion broke out in East Anglia, known as the Ketts Rebellion, and this is where John Dudley crawls his way in. Somerset decided he would sympathize with the rebels and offer them pardons. This outraged the council, and a coup was formed. Acting against direct orders from Somerset, the Privy Council sent fellow member John Dudley and an army to confront the rebels. Dudley was victorious, and the rebels were defeated. And with this, the council's faith in Somerset had run out. Somerset fled and took the king with him. Without the backing of the council, he was almost completely powerless, and Edward was his last bargaining chip. John was raised to the dukedom of Northumberland due to his victory against the rebels. He had done what Somerset couldn't. Jane's parents quickly abandoned their support of Somerset and fell under the banner of the new Duke, John Dudley. Somerset was arrested on October 11, 1549. He and the king were brought to Richmond Palace for Somerset to stand trial. His title of leader of the Privy Council was stripped from him, and he was no longer the Lord Protector of the king. Edward read his uncle's charges at his trial, quote, "Ambition, vainglory, entering into rash wars in mine youth, negligent looking on Newhaven, enriching himself of my treasure, following his own opinion, and doing all by his own authority." February of 1550, John Dudley was elected as Somerset's successor and the new leader of the council. Somerset was imprisoned in the Tower, but later released and restored to the council, where John Dudley befriended him and made peace. Knowing that Somerset was still popular amongst the people and still held a lot of money and power. As a sign of reconciliation, John's eldest son, also named John, married Somerset's daughter, Anne. But Somerset was not pleased with these turn of events and rallied support and sympathizers, hoping to re-establish his power and remove Dudley from his newly acquired power and title. He openly campaigned and obstructed Dudley's policies. John now knew he had to be rid of him. Somerset was arrested and accused of planning a banquet massacre that would have seen Dudley killed. But again, there's literally no evidence of this, and Somerset was acquitted of treason, but later randomly convicted of felony. Somerset was sentenced to death on largely fabricated charges and was executed on January 22nd, 1552, at the age of 52. John Dudley had successfully offed his rival and positioned himself and his family to be the next powerhouse in England. He became the Grand Master of the King's household, a similar title and role as Somerset's, Lord Protector, with some differences. John Dudley's triumph was short-lived when in May of 1553, Edward VI's doctor privately informed John that the king would not live past autumn. John needed a plan B in order to maintain his powerful position. He was aware that Jane and her sisters, Catherine and Mary, were added into the line of succession by Henry's last will, but Mary and Elizabeth and any heirs they might possibly produce were still in line before Jane. Knowing this, he devised a marriage contract between his son, Guildford Dudley, and the Lady Jane Grey. With Jane's parents being faithful supporters of John Dudley, they accepted the proposal. On May 25, 1553, Jane and Guildford were married at Durham House. The wedding lasted 2 days and was quite the spectacle, with a joust, feasts, and 2 masks. It was attended by the majority of English nobility. Unfortunately, due to his health, Edward could not attend, but he sent gifts of rich ornaments and jewels in his place. Edward wrote his device of succession, which, to the surprise of most, skipped Mary and Elizabeth and named Jane as his successor. It is widely believed that John Dudley had a hand in this new succession. He had just married his son to an obscure Tudor descendant, and now she was heir to the throne of England, which would tragically soon be vacant. While I do think John was in the king's ear at this time, pushing him towards this conclusion, I think a lot of this was Edward's own doing. Keeping his Catholic sister off the throne was immensely important to him. Even though he had only reigned for a few short years, he had made tremendous leaps for Protestants in England. The thought of Mary ascending and unraveling everything he had worked for would have easily persuaded him to remove her as his successor. England wasn't the only country stressing about the death of Edward VI. All of Europe was worried about who would succeed him. Whoever was chosen could throw off the balance of power. But what about Elizabeth? She, like her mother, was Protestant and had grown up practicing the faith. And she, like Jane, was a member of Catherine Parr's household, which is where Jane learned a lot of her Protestant teachings. Why was she brushed over for Jane? This is where, in my opinion, John Dudley comes in. It was his influence that saw Edward skip Elizabeth in favor of Jane, who was now his daughter-in-law. Edward's health was rapidly declining. Even though he had made his final wishes on the succession clear, a lot of people were put off by it because it actively went against his father's last will and the third act of succession, which at the time was actually seen as an act of treason. During his last days, Mary was kept well informed on her brother's condition, and once she had concluded that his death was imminent, she fled to her estates in Norfolk, knowing she had the support of her tenants who had taken part in the Ket's Rebellion. Edward VI's eventual death on July 6, 1553, was kept a secret to give John time to raise a force in order to detain Mary, who he believed would remain in London in order to mourn the death of her brother, but she was long gone. Jane was not told about the death of the king until 3 days later on July 9th. When John Dudley informed her she was the next Queen of England, Jane reportedly said, quote, "The crown is not my right and pleases me not. The Lady Mary is the rightful heir." All accounts of Jane on this day paint her as extremely reluctant, and one even states that she fainted when she was told that she would succeed Edward. Though I don't know how much of this I believe, and I'll go into further detail why I feel this way in my conclusion, I do think it was all extremely unfair to Jane. Jane was set up as a flimsy placeholder, so other people could rule through her, most notably John and her husband Guildford. John attempted to persuade the obedient Jane to make Guildford a de facto king, but surprisingly, Jane refused to name Guildford as king. She gave him the title of the Duke of Clarence, to the horror of her new in-laws. The story goes that Jane would not accept the crown until her parents arrived and persuaded her to do so. A lot of people believe that their persuasion tactics were violent. There is no way to prove or deny this. She eventually did accept, believing that if she was meant to be queen, God would protect her. On the same day, Mary sent a letter to the council proclaiming her right to the throne and demanding they name her queen, but Jane's ascension was already underway. Jane, her husband Guildford, her parents, Francis and Henry, and her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland, were brought to the Tower. It was tradition for the future king or queen to stay in the royal apartments in the Tower before their coronation. It was here that Jane was officially proclaimed queen. She was only 16 years old. John, now fully aware that Mary had fled, raised an army of 3,000 men to pursue her, and with his future queen tucked safely away in the Tower, he left. But Mary was already on the move, with her staggering 20,000 men, and she was already declared queen in certain counties and townships. Jane did not remain idle. She wrote to sheriffs and justices of the peace reminding them of their allegiance to the crown, trying to regain their support. She signed each of these letters as Jane the Queen. Jane began raising an army, knowing she would need to fight for her throne. But it was too late. Support for Jane Grey evaporated overnight when the council suddenly defected and backed Mary's claim and not Jane's, making her, John Dudley, Guildford Dudley, and her father Henry Grey enemies of the state. Mary and her supporters assembled at Framlingham Castle and watched as the Dudley regime crumbled. And of course, John Dudley quickly swapped sides, pledging himself to Mary. John was arrested shortly after his return to London. His sons Robert, Ambrose, and Henry were also arrested and were all imprisoned in the Tower. With the council now declaring Mary as queen, Jane was moved from the royal apartments to a small house within the Tower grounds. Guildford also remained on the grounds, but he was separated from Jane. On July 27th, Jane's father, Henry Grey, was brought to the Tower. This saddened her greatly. In an attempt to save her family, Frances Grey traveled through the night to speak with the future Queen Mary. There, she begged her cousin to release her family, claiming that her husband and daughter had only been pawns of Dudley. Mary heard her cousin's pleas and pardoned Henry Grey and released him. She even promised to pardon Jane once Mary was officially crowned. It was too risky to release the young girl before the new queen's coronation. There are a lot of people who believe that Frances only petitioned for her husband's release and not her daughter's, and I think this is because only Henry was pardoned and Jane remained in the Tower. There is no evidence to support that Frances only begged for Henry's release, and like I stated previously, there is a good reason for Mary to keep Jane imprisoned at the time. Mary made her famous bloodless entry into London on August 1st, 1553, but she would not be officially crowned until October 1st of 1553. John Dudley was executed on October 22nd, 1553, where he fully recanted his Protestant faith, possibly as one last attempt to show devotion to Mary in hopes she might spare him, or it was a planned propaganda by Mary's new government. Jane's trial was held on November 13th at Guildhall in London. Jane and Guildford Dudley, as well as his two brothers, Ambrose and Henry, were charged with high treason. All were found guilty and sentenced to death. Jane's personal charge was for treacherously assuming the title and power of the monarch. The evidence against her were the letters she signed as Jane the Queen. The men were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Jane would be burned alive, the traditional death for women found guilty of treason at the time, or beheaded. Even though Jane was found guilty, it seems at this time that Mary still planned on releasing her. In a letter to Charles V sent from the imperial ambassador, reportedly states that Mary did not plan on putting Jane to death. It's possible that Mary planned to release Jane once tensions began to simmer. Though Jane would never again be allowed at the English court, she could have quietly retired to her parents' estates and lived in relative comfort for the rest of her life. But sadly, this is not how Jane's story ends. In January of 1554, the Wyatt Rebellion broke out. It was started by committed Protestant Thomas Wyatt the Younger to prevent the marriage of Mary I to the Catholic Prince Philip of Spain. The rebels were also motivated by the fall in living standards in England caused by inflation, food shortages, and a decline in trade. Though never openly declared, their plan was to dethrone Mary and crown her younger sister Elizabeth in her place. I have a correction here. In my episode on Mary Tudor, I said that it was the rebellion's plan to place Jane on the throne. This is not correct. Jane's eventual execution was an unintended consequence of the rebellion. Jane's father joined in support of the rebels, which looked bad for Jane. His actions were what implicated her in the rebellion and swayed Mary's opinion of Jane. I do think Henry had good intentions. If the rebellion had been successful and Elizabeth crowned queen, in return for his loyalty, he could have asked for Jane's release. Though I have serious doubt that Elizabeth would have done so. I think he possibly saw this as his only opportunity to save his daughter. A few thousand Kent rebels marched on London but were quickly put down by Mary's armed response. Thomas Wyatt surrendered in February of 1544 and was tried and executed along with 90 other rebels. Mary now knew that Jane would forever pose a threat if she remained alive. She would not leave her to become a potential figurehead for any future revolts. Jane's execution was now inevitable. Though she was condemned to death, Jane found great comfort during her time in the Tower. It seems as though she finally had the time to devote herself fully to her faith, and in her beliefs she found peace. Guildford asked to see Jane one last time before his execution, but she refused. It's hard to know her reasoning here. Though sparse, there is some evidence that Jane never liked Guildford, and refusing to see him was her final act of spite. I think she liked him as much as a 17-year-old girl in an arranged marriage could like her husband, meaning I think his feelings were rather inconsequential to her, because again, she was only 17. But it is possible she felt like she couldn't maintain her composure and would further increase their pain, since Jane believed they would meet again shortly after death. On the morning of February 12, 1554, Guildford was led towards Tower Hill, where a small crowd waited. He did not recant his faith like his father, and asked the crowd to pray for him. He was killed with one stroke of the axe at the age of 18. Apparently, Jane watched Guildford's body being moved from the scaffold to a waiting cart from her window. Shortly after, the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir John Bridges, led Jane out to a private scaffold on the Tower Green. She kept her composure as her ladies-in-waiting wept. She is described as wearing all black and carrying her prayer book, the same one given to her by Catherine Parr, which she read from the entire way. She climbed the scaffold and asked the lieutenant if she could speak. He agreed. Quote, "Good people, I come hither to die, and by Allah I am condemned to do the same. The fact, indeed, against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me. But touching the procurement and desire thereof by me, or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God, and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." She then thanked her ladies and companions. Then she removed her gloves and handkerchief and handed over her prayer book. With the help of her ladies, she removed her gown, headdress, and collar. She knelt down on the straw and asked, quote, "I pray you, dispatch me quickly to the executioner," then knelt before the block where a blindfold was placed across her eyes. Now unable to see the block, she began to panic, saying, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A bystander approached and led her to the block, where she placed her head and said, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." She was swiftly beheaded with one blow of the axe on February 12, 1554. She remains the youngest royal woman to be condemned for treason in British history. She was only 17 years old. My final thoughts on Jane can be summarized by a quote from Alison Plowden, writer of the Oxford Dictionary National Biography entry on Jane. Quote, "The circumstances surrounding Jane's life and death inevitably made her an icon as a Protestant martyr, and consequently have so colored posterity's view of her that it is so difficult now to see beyond the religious bias." I spoke a bit on this in my episode of Mary Tudor, And for the same reasons that Mary is remembered as a literal villain, Jane is remembered as a saint. After Mary's rather disastrous reign, her successor Elizabeth made her opinion clear. Mary's prosecution of Protestants was strictly condemned, and the execution of their cousin Jane was a tragedy. When people are maligned or exalted in history, it's very hard to discern the facts from fiction, because most of the time there are some not-so-secret agendas at play. In this case, there was an obvious religious power struggle, with the Protestant ruler Elizabeth prevailing over her Catholic sister and condemning her religiously charged actions. Because Jane was a prosecuted Protestant, I say with quotations because I don't believe Jane's death was religiously charged like that of Thomas Cranmer. Like I mentioned earlier, I think Mary would have released Jane if the Wyatt Rebellion had not begun, but because she was killed by the heretical Mary, it serves the prevailing Protestant nobles and Elizabeth to paint her as the ultimate Protestant martyr. Therefore, it is hard to know what Jane actually lived through, and what was purposely overfabricated to depict her as the ultimate tortured soul, like her over-the-top abusive parents, her arranged marriage to a man she never liked, and being made to forcefully accept the crown against her will. It paints a picture of a rather clueless girl who was forced into a situation that would inevitably land her on the chopping block. But let me be clear, I do think Jane had an entirely unfair life. She was only 17 years old when she dies. It was beyond unfair that she was put in a position against her will, a position she would never have pursued herself. But Jane was duty-bound and took on her new role. We can see this by her actions during Mary's final push for power and her letter sign as Jane the Queen. Jane's life was tragically cut short because the people around her used her birthright and royal blood as a means to produce their own happy endings, completely oblivious to the harm they placed her in. Or they simply just didn't care. Thankfully, Jane is remembered, and though we may never know how much of her story is veiled by martyrdom, the real guilty parties still shine through, and thankfully, karma did not skip them.